Some places hold on to their stories like whispers caught in the trees, a place where time slows, the air grows heavy, and the shadows stretch just a little longer than they should. Union Cemetery in the quiet town of Easton, Connecticut is one such place. Its neatly lined gravestones and weathered chapels seem ordinary by daylight. But when night falls, Union Cemetery becomes a stage for the strange and the spectral, a place where folklore and history intertwine. If you visit, you might hear the faint sound of a woman singing, soft as a lullaby, or perhaps you'll feel time slip through your fingers as though the cemetery itself has swallowed the hours. Tonight on Podcast Folklore, we revisit the shadows of Union Cemetery, exploring the voices, mysteries, and the echoes of the past that refuse to be silent. In Union Cemetery, silence is not as peaceful as it seems. It's a silence that's filled with whispers, faint, urgent voices calling from the shadows, lingering in the air and carried through the rustling trees. Visitors have often reported hearing voices in the cemetery, often so quiet that they may be mistaken for the wind. Yet there's something unmistakable about them, something that suggests they're not just figments of imagination, but echoes of a past that refuse to be forgotten. One of the most chilling accounts comes from Samantha Wilcox, a paranormal investigator from Bridgeport, Connecticut, who was exploring the cemetery in 2007. She had heard the stories of Union Cemetery's otherworldly happenings and came with a group of fellow investigators to see if the rumours were true. Armed with a digital recorder, she walked slowly between the weathered gravestones, her footsteps crunching in the cool night air. As she approached the grave of Mary Hawthorne, a young woman who had died in 1867, she felt a sudden coldness sweep over her. Mary Hawthorne's death has always been a mystery. Rumours suggest that she'd been a victim of a violent crime, perhaps at the hands of a scorned lover, but no one's ever been charged with her death. As Samantha stood before Mary's grave, a chill crept down her spine. She felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if the very earth beneath her feet held secrets long buried. As her recorder ran, she didn't hear anything at the moment, but when she listened to the playback, she was struck by a voice, soft yet unmistakable, pleading, "Help me." The voice seemed to have come from nowhere. No one else had been in the cemetery with her at that time. The sound was faint but desperate, as though it had been trapped in time, unable to find peace. This EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon, captured by Samantha that night was a turning point in her research. She went on to investigate further and learned that Mary's death had left an indelible mark on the community. Some local historians claimed that Mary had been a young woman full of promise, her life cut short under suspicious circumstances. Others whispered that she had been involved in a forbidden romance. But whatever the cause, it was clear that Mary's spirit, and perhaps her unfulfilled desires, had lingered in the Union Cemetery, and now it seemed that she was calling out for help. Paranormal experts as far away as New York City have listened to Samantha's recording and agreed that the voice is unlike any normal ambient noise. Some suggested that Mary's death, still shrouded in mystery, might be the source of her restless spirit. Her voice, trapped in the ether, could be trying to communicate something about her tragic fate. Others believe that the cemetery itself is a nexus for the souls lost to time. Their voices faint echoes that only the right equipment or the right person can capture. But Samantha's experience wasn't the only one. Back in the summer of 1962, a group of Boy Scouts from Troop 23 in Easton set up camp near the outskirts of Union Cemetery. The cemetery itself, though surrounded by woods, was a well-known landmark, and the boys, led by their scoutmaster Mr. Richard Kelly, had heard stories of the local folklore surrounding the place. The camp was set up as a bonding experience, but soon it became a night that they would never forget. At around midnight, Thomas Riley, a 14-year-old scout, awoke to the sound of his name being called. It wasn't just a random shout or the call of a fellow scout. The voice seemed to come from the darkness, from the woods near the cemetery. Confused and disoriented, he sat up in his sleeping bag and looked around, but saw no one. And then to his horror, he heard his name again, this time louder, more insistent. He wasn't alone. One by one, the boys began to hear their names called out as well. Some heard voices in the woods, others swore the voices were coming from the cemetery itself, that it was too dark to make out any shapes. But the most unsettling part of the experience was that the voices seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the cemetery itself had become a stage for the unseen performance. The boys tried to stay calm, attributing the sound to the wind or unusual trick of the mind in the dark. But the atmosphere had grown thick, oppressive, too heavy to dismiss. As the voices continued, an intense cold swept through the camp, freezing them to the bone. No one dare venture out into the dark woods or the cemetery, and soon the group huddled together, feeling trapped in the middle of something that they just didn't understand. The voices stopped as suddenly as they started, leaving the boys shaken and unnerved. And years later, when recounting the event, Thomas Riley described the experience as a moment of pure terror, an event so inexplicable that it could not be easily shaken. He, along with the other Boy Scouts, remained convinced that they heard the voices of the cemetery's long-dead residents calling to them. They have never returned to the camp near Union Cemetery. We fast forward to 2019, and Daniel Cooper, a local historian who had been documenting Easton's history, ventured into Union Cemetery late one evening. Daniel had heard the old tales about the cemetery, but as he approached his visit with historian skepticism, he had hoped to uncover details about the early settlers of Easton who had been buried in the older sections of the cemetery. Armed with a notebook and a recorder, Daniel walked carefully between the older graves. But when he arrived at the grave of Elias Collins, a settler who passed away in 1824, he began speaking aloud, hoping to capture some historical insight through his recorder. As he talked, explaining the purpose of his visit, something strange occurred. A soft voice interrupted him. The words were indistinct, but a tone of urgency hung in the air. When Daniel played the recording back, he was struck by what he heard. A faint whisper, almost a plea, though its meaning could not be made out. He sat alone in the cemetery, listening to the eerie sound. He felt an overwhelming sense of being connected to the past, as if the voices were trying to reach across the centuries. As Daniel couldn't be certain about the source of the voice, he found it unsettling. After listening to his recording several times, he shared it during his lectures. It sparked questions and discussions about the possibility that the cemetery harbours the restless spirits of those long gone. He is now convinced that Union Cemetery is a place where the dead don't stay silent. They speak to those who are willing to listen. Union Cemetery isn't just known for its ghostly whispers or eerie sounds. Some nights, it is the air itself that seems to hum with the memory of a song, an unfamiliar haunting melody that lingers long after the wind dies down. Visitors often report hearing the soft, almost ethereal sound of a woman singing, a song that floats through the cemetery on a calm night, rising from nowhere like the echo of an old forgotten memory. The melody is described as mournful, deeply beautiful, but strange, something that feels both timeless and unsettling. It's a song that has no clear source, no obvious singer. No one can quite identify it, and yet it resonates with such a raw emotion that it feels as though it carries a story long from beyond the grave. Some say it sounds like a lullaby, or others a ballad of sorrow. And though the song never lasts long, the impression it leaves is enough to make anyone stop in their tracks, caught in the otherworldly pull of the music. One of the most detailed accounts of this eerie singing came in 2011, when local musician David Callan, known for his love of folk music, visited Union Cemetery. David had heard the stories of strange occurrences in the cemetery, but as a skeptic, he was more interested in the quiet beauty of the place, an opportunity to reflect and write. Carrying his guitar, he wandered through the gravestones, struck by the serenity of the night. The cemetery, blanketed in mist, felt strangely peaceful. But then, just as he stood near an old stone chapel, he heard it, the soft sound of a woman's voice floating through the air. The singing wasn't loud, but it was distinct, clear as a bell, yet distant, like a memory of a long-lost tune. The voice was sweet, but also mournful, as though it was floating on the air, untethered by time or place. It was a song that felt familiar, but impossible to place. Something like a lullaby or an old folk song, but unlike anything David had ever heard before. At first, David thought someone else was nearby, but there was no one in sight. He stood still for a moment, captivated by this strange music, before instinctively reaching for his guitar. It was almost as if the melody had beckoned him, urging him to join in, and as he began to play, matching the chords to the rhythm of the song, the melody seemed to shift in response. His guitar blended with the voice, creating a harmony that felt oddly right. But then, just as quickly as it begun, the song stopped. The woman's voice faded into the air, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. David, standing alone with his guitar, felt a chill sweep over him. He looked around, but saw no one. No source of the song at once filled the space around him. His guitar strings felt strangely out of place now, as if he had joined something that was never meant to be interrupted. The stillness returned to the cemetery, but the haunting melody lingered in his mind. Later, David would describe the experience as both beautiful and deeply unsettling, a connection to that something that can't be explained, yet profoundly real. So who was the singing woman, and why did she choose that moment to make her presence known? Some local lore points to the tragic story tied to Union Cemetery that could explain the phantom voice. One theory suggests that the singing woman is the spirit of Eliza Hawthorne, a young widow who lived in Easton in the late 1800s. Eliza's husband, a well-known local merchant, died unexpectedly, leaving her alone to raise the young daughter. Devastated by her loss, Eliza often walked to the Union Cemetery to visit her husband's grave. And during those visits, she would sing to him a song of love and longing. Her grief was so deep, it was said that her voice could be heard echoing through the cemetery on quiet nights, as though she was still there, singing for him. Some believe Eliza's spirit lingers in the cemetery, her sorrow woven into the very air, waiting for someone to hear her song. Other versions of the story suggest that the singing woman is not one specific individual, but the combined sorrow of all the women who have grieved in the cemetery over the centuries. Perhaps it was a collective longing of those who had lost their loved ones, their voices intertwined through time, haunting the cemetery in a chorus of memory. In 2015, another visitor, Claire Thompson, an artist from New Haven, had a similar experience whilst walking through Union Cemetery late one evening. She had come to the cemetery to sketch the old chapel and gravestones, hoping to capture the cemetery's eerie beauty. As Claire sketched, she heard the singing as well. Soft, distant, but also real. She thought it was coming from just behind her. The melody was nearly the same as David Callion's description, and Claire immediately froze, holding her breath, listening. But when she turned around, there was no one to be seen. The experience left Claire with an unshakable feeling that the cemetery is more than just a resting place for the dead. It was alive with something beyond the physical. She later spoke about other artists and musicians who had visited the cemetery and found that they too had heard the singing at some point during their visits. Some even claimed that the melody would change depending on the mood of the listener. So what is it about Union Cemetery that seems to awaken this ethereal music? Is it a restless spirit clinging to the memory of love and loss, or is it something deeper, an imprint left on the land itself, resonating with those who are open to hearing it? The singing woman remains one of Union Cemetery's most enduring mysteries, a voice that calls out from the past, offering a glimpse into the long-forgotten sorrow. For those who hear it, the experience is impossible to forget, an intimate encounter with a piece of cemetery's soul, lingering just out of reach. Among the many haunting stories and unexplained phenomenon that swirl around at Union Cemetery, one of the most perplexing involves a gravestone that stands slightly apart from the others, weathered and unassuming, and marked simply with the name Hannah Knapp. But those who have ventured near the grave know how the appearance can be deceiving. Hannah Knapp had passed away in 1850. Isn't just another name carved into the stones of the old cemetery. Her grave had become the centre of a strange, inexplicable series of events that continue to baffle visitors and paranormal investigators alike. Unlike many other graves in Union Cemetery, which bear the names of well-known figures from the town's history, Hannah's resting place is quiet and solitary. There are no grand marker or ornate memorial to announce her presence, but it is precisely this simplicity that has drawn the attention to those who believe in the supernatural. Hannah Knapp was a woman whose life, like so many others, was filled with the ordinary struggles of the time: marriage, family, and community. She was a respected figure in Easton, well liked by her neighbours, and her death in 1850 was considered that of a natural cause. There was no scandal or mystery surrounding her passing, nothing that would explain why her grave would become the site of so many strange occurrences. Yet over the years, the grave of Hannah Knapp has become infamous for its bizarre and unsettling phenomenon. In the early 1980s, a local man named Brian Edwards was one of the first to publicly recount an eerie experience tied to Hannah's grave. Brian, a teenager at the time, had heard rumours of strange happenings in Union Cemetery, and one night, out of curiosity, he and a group of friends decided to explore the cemetery under the cover of darkness. The group wandered the cemetery for a while, checking out the famous graves and snapping photos, and as they neared Hannah Knapp's resting place, things began to take a turn. Brian felt a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air. He tried to shake it off, but after all, it was a crisp autumn evening and the cemetery was located in a heavily wooded area. But the coldness seemed to surround him, almost as though the air had thickened. His friends joked about the old legends they had heard, but Brian couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. When they stopped near the grave of Hannah Knapp, Brian felt a strange, unmistakable sensation, a light, cold pressure around his wrist. He looked down in confusion, only to feel that it seemed like a cold hand was gripping his arm. His friends, busy with their own activities, didn't notice, but Brian swore he could feel the fingers, icy and skeletal, pressing against his skin. He looked around, feeling both panic and disbelief, but there was no one else nearby. And when he turned back to the grave, something even more unsettling happened. Standing just behind the gravestone was a faint, shadowy outline, a figure of a woman so transparent that it was almost impossible to discern any clear features. Brian stood frozen, staring at the apparition until it slowly faded into the night. The cold sensation lifted, and the shadow vanished, leaving Brian with only a lingering sense of dread. His friends dismissed his claims as a product of his own imagination, but Brian knew what he had felt and what he had seen. Since that night, more reports of unusual occurrences around Hannah's grave have resurfaced. Visitors to Union Cemetery have often noticed that flowers left on a grave tend to wilt with an accelerated rate, while the flowers on surrounding graves remain fresh and vibrant. It is as though something about the ground itself is different around Hannah's resting place. The local florist who had delivered flowers to Union Cemetery for decades has even commented that the bouquets left at Hannah's grave will often appear droopy and lifeless by the following morning, even if the weather had been clear and warm. But flowers left at the graves of others, many of whom are more famous or significant to Easton's history, will remain unblemished. Local paranormal investigator Claudia Miller, who has spent years studying Union Cemetery, believes that the strange occurrences at Hannah's graves are not merely coincidence. According to Claudia, there is a deep connection between the grave and the energy that seems to radiate from it. It is as though the grave is a focal point for something, she said in 2018. Something tied to the land itself, or perhaps something tied to the woman buried there. We don't know if it's her spirit, or if it's something that has become attached to the grave over the years, but it's definitely an unusual energy around it. And one of the most disturbing reports comes from a woman named Teresa MacDonald, who visited the cemetery in 1995. Teresa, an avid photographer, was hoping to capture the eerie beauty of Union Cemetery's old stones and forgotten markers. As she stood near Hannah's grave, snapping a few pictures, she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. At first, she thought it was simply her imagination, that she'd heard a faint rustling behind her. And when she turned around, she saw, to her shock, that the dirt around the grave had slightly shifted, as if someone had been digging despite no one being there for hours. Her camera malfunctioned at that moment, and when she reviewed the photos she had taken, one stood out as especially strange. In the image, you can clearly see the silhouette of a woman standing behind the gravestone, though the photograph was taken early evening and there were no other visitors in the cemetery at the time. The image was so disturbing that Teresa kept it hidden for years, unsure whether it was a trick of light or something much darker. Could Hannah's grave be the site of a lingering mystery that one transcends both time and reason? But some believe that the spirits of those buried in Union Cemetery remain tied to the land, unable to fully move on due to unfinished business or lingering emotions. Could Hannah Knapp's restless spirit still linger, waiting for something or someone. Others point to the possibility that the cemetery itself might be built on a site of significance long before the town of Easton existed. Perhaps the grave of Hannah Knapp, like so many others in the cemetery, serves as a gateway for the dead, drawing paranormal activity that manifests in strange ways. The truth remains elusive, but there is one thing that is certain. There is something about the grave of Hannah Knapp that continues to haunt the visitors who come across it, and the strange occurrences tied to it show no signs of stopping anytime soon. And the question remains, what is it that lingers in the shadows of Union Cemetery, waiting for the living to uncover? While Union Cemetery is the home to countless spirits, it's only the dead of the human form that are seen haunting the grounds. Among the more curious legends of the Eerie Cemetery is the tale of the ghostly dog, an apparition that is seen by many over the years, yet remains one of the most perplexing mysteries of the cemetery's hauntings. Unlike most spectral entities, the ghost dog is not a figure of terror or malice. It is something else entirely. Described as a large black dog with glowing eyes, the apparition is said to appear to those who are lost or frightened, offering comfort and guidance in the form of its silent presence. It's not a creature of menace. In fact, the ghost dog is believed by some to be a protector, a guide for the living who stray too far to the cemetery's shadowy depths. The first recorded encounter with a spectral dog dates back to 1921, when a woman named Clara Jenkins found herself wandering the cemetery at night. Clara, a resident of Easton, has been trying to locate the grave of her great-grandfather during a particularly foggy evening. As she made her way through the darkened cemetery, the fog grew denser, and she found herself disoriented. The gravestones faded into the mist and seemed to shift and twist as she walked, and soon she couldn't remember which direction she had come from. Panicked, Clara called out into the dark, but no answer had come. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on tombstones around her. It was in that moment she noticed something moving in the mist, a large black shape that appeared suddenly, as if from nowhere. She froze, her heart pounding, unsure of what she was seeing. The creature's eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, a haunting contrast to the fog that had surrounded it. For a brief moment, she was certain it was something malevolent, potentially dangerous. But then, as the shape moved closer, she realized that it was a dog, and it wasn't aggressive or threatening at all. Instead, it stood still, watching her with a calmness that almost seemed reassuring. The ghost dog, as it would soon be called, did not bark or growl. It didn't seem to notice Clara's fear. Instead, it began slowly walking away from her, looking back over its shoulder as if waiting for her to follow. She hesitated for a moment, and then decided to trust the creature, believing it's some sort of guiding spirit that was sent to guide her back to safety. Without thinking, she followed the dog as it moved steadily through the cemetery, its black form fading in and out of the mist. And to her surprise, the dog led Clara straight back to the cemetery's main gate, and it seems that the fog had started to lift. As the cemetery gate came into view, the ghost stopped, turned, and disappeared into the mist as quietly as it come. Clara had stood there. She was shaken but relieved, but with no explanation for the mysterious creature she had encountered. The dog was gone, but the presence remained with her. She never doubted what she had seen that night. It was something beyond the realm of living that had helped her and guided her home. And since Clara's encounter, reports of the ghost dog have continued to surface. Over the years, visitors to the Union Cemetery have claimed that they'd seen it on numerous occasions, particularly on foggy evenings or during the hours when dusk bleeds into night. Witnesses described the dog as being larger than any normal animal, with an unnatural silence about it. And despite its size, there is no sound of its paws hitting the ground, no echoes of footsteps or rustling in the leaves. It moves with a kind of eerie grace, its glowing eyes piercing through the gloom, silently urging those who encounter it to follow. One particular notable instance took place in 1964, when a young couple named Richard and Laura Whittaker decided to take a walk through the cemetery after dark. Richard had heard the local rumours about the ghost dog, but had not given it much thought. However, as they walked through the cemetery's older sections, they began to feel a sense of unease. The temperature seemed to have dropped, and an unexplainable silence settled over the cemetery, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Richard and Laura spotted a large, dark shape moving in the distance. The The closer it came, the more clearly they could make out the outline of a dog. Richard, somewhat unnerved but dismissive of the ghost stories, called out to the creature, thinking it was a stray animal. But the dog didn't respond to his voice. Instead, it simply paused, turned, and began to slowly walk down the path, looking back as though waiting for them to follow. The couple, drawn by an unspoken instinct, began walking behind the dog. It led them through the cemetery's labyrinth of headstones, down pathways they hadn't noticed before. And after a few minutes, they were near the gate, the same path that they had taken when entering the cemetery, but it now seemed different. The eerie silence had lifted, and the oppressive feeling that had been haunting them was gone. And when they reached the gate, the dog stopped once again, turned, and vanished into the night, leaving the couple stunned but safe. In more recent years, paranormal investigators have also encountered the ghost dog whilst conducting their research in Union Cemetery. In 2007, a team led by local investigator Samantha Wilcox set up cameras and audio recording equipment throughout the cemetery. As the night wore on, they began to hear the faint sound of footsteps, soft, steady, but strangely muffled. At first, they seemed assured that there was another member of the team, but when they reviewed the footage, they found no one in the frame at the time the sound was captured. And as the night drew to a close, Samantha and her team experienced the unmistakable sensation they were being followed. And then, just before the dawn began to break, the dog appeared, walking calmly in front of their cameras, and then disappearing into the fog as though they had been there all along. Samantha later stated in an interview that while they didn't capture any clear footage of the ghost dog, the experience left her feeling both comforted but unnerved. There was something almost too real about the encounter, something that suggested the dog wasn't a simple fragment of their imagination, but an entity that had been watching over the cemetery for far longer than anyone could understand. So why does the ghost dog appear to certain visitors? Some believe the dog is a guardian spirit that offers safety and guidance in moments of need. Others suggest that the animal might be tied to the land itself, a manifestation of the cemetery's ancient energy that has taken form as a protector for those who wander too far into the haunted depths. There are even some who speculate that the ghost dog could be a spirit of a long-dead pet, lost and seeking out its former owners. But whatever its origin, the fact remains, the ghost dog is a comforting presence for those who are fortunate enough to encounter it. And as strange as it may sound, the idea that a spectral animal could be a guide in the dark, leading the lost souls to safety, isn't entirely new. In folklore from around the world, ghostly animals often serve as protectors or warnings, guiding the lost, warning of danger, or even leading the living to unmarked graves and long-buried secrets. The ghost dog of Union Cemetery fits neatly into this tradition, offering an eerie sense of reassurance for those who find themselves wandering its fog-covered paths. But as with all stories of Union Cemetery, the mystery of the ghost dog endures, its true nature remaining just out of reach, shrouded in the mist and shadows. Union Cemetery is a place where the veil between worlds feels thin, where every shadow seems to hold a story. From the quiet, watchful presence of Mrs. Knapp's grave, to the loyal spectral dog who leads the lost back to safety, from the haunting voice of a woman whose song drifts in the night air to the whispered pleas that seems to rise from the earth itself, these tales remind us that the past is never truly silent. The stories of Union Cemetery linger like a chill in the evening air, as though the spirits who dwell there ask not to be forgotten. We are left to wonder, are these encounters echoes of lives long forgotten, or are they something more? A reminder, perhaps, that even in death we crave to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. But maybe that's what draws us to places like Union Cemetery, our need to connect with those who came before us, to give meaning to what we don't understand. Ghosts, after all, aren't just spectres of the dead. Sometimes they're reflections of our own fears, hopes, curiosities. So thank you for joining me as we wandered through the legends of Union Cemetery. And like all good stories, we shall be returning to the cemetery because it holds more stories to tell. And if these stories gave you the chills, or maybe just made you think a little differently about your world, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support keeps this podcast alive, just like the tales we share. And if you have your own story of a strange or unexplained, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And who knows, it could be the inspiration for a future episode. And so, until next time, keep exploring the world with wonder.